아래랑 그것이 코알레 코리아기 유조디 뉴모바레스 제자의 뉴모바디 님보디 땡치 뉴모베 님보들 베 지다디 아주 뉴모보 님보디 컴퓨터와 배하고를 심비 뉴모보 님보들 베 지가와시우기제 내려 안에 체력 아주 배제시는 뉴모보들 님비 담에도 비셔라들 공부레스 근데 뉴모보들 마바한테 지금도 사 코알레 라신이가 동을 제한 자원문이도 뉴모보들 제샤다 뉴모보들 마반데 이내 지금 있는 선배가 도시는 삼단지네 요 도시는 삼단이 뭐고 즉 어도스 뉴모벌이 방비 배진체고레스 제자다 뉴모버 방발이야 지다 다지 세텔이야 류다 소다 되니게 강아 가서 유변이야 델레 데 강아디기 춘조를 제자다 뉴모버지기 지게 원그 코알레 깨와레 동안요 빠스메 봐 차이도 제자디네 자다 녀모버들이야 근데 안지게 원도 마땅하지 녀모버 님보 된제 방화지 인생의 삼다지도 시네 다 녀모 님보를 방야를 비지 지고를 해서 그 생각도 되게 쉬러하다.
Good evening. Last week we continued to look to generate the mind of a strong and stable determination to gain freedom from suffering. In particular, in relation to the two verses we looked at last week, we saw that having come to recognize that the very cause for our ongoing circling in the suffering realms of cyclic existence is the afflictions on our own continuum. There, having recognized this and having come to understand the antidote to the afflictions, one generates an enthusiasm to eradicate our afflictions, to no longer come under their sway, but to stand up to them and no longer be deceived by them. And in particular, we looked at the need to do so consistently, to never allow oneself to be deceived by them. And to generate this strong and stable determination, we looked at how the hardships that one endures in order to overcome the afflictions, to break our habituation to the afflictions. Those hardships are insignificant when compared to the sufferings that one experiences for lifetimes if one does come under the influence of the afflictions. Then, continuing with the text, we're staying with the general topic of looking at the need to abandon the afflictions. So the 45th verse in the 4th chapter. When ordinary enemies are banished from one land, they settle elsewhere, and having embraced it, recover their strength to return once again. But there is no similar course for this enemy, my afflictions.
Tenegi tawdi yune chuna ya se da anjugi jitelia jigpa jigmara jawina da karagina ko jeje ko kate joje ko anju lumba pa bisha ba ina se da chuna ya bisha ba ina ko an lumba shanda ji pa ro je yu shan da do ne xin yong so ne se yu lumba shanda ji do go res ne an adu shin da wo din do go res di ba de.
Looking at the first two lines, with our common enemies or our ordinary enemies in this world, once they are banished and they have to leave where they reside, they will settle elsewhere and make that their home.
That you shanda lumba shanda taring buchil to dueshe, then nation, then yonsu, yes, that delia, and Yanko, Nubal Masona, Jiki Twinkin Tukuya, Tubche, and Nubal Masona, that Jik Horonsiki, Mammy Tilia, and Sanjeri, 다리나 튕긴 두고 죽지 요소 손에 뉴버 데네스다 그 뉴버디 가라가서는 뉴버 첨부 차요도 되네 실도 그냥 수 은수 요지는 마잡제 마자리 용거리에서
having settled somewhere new, they will still plot and plan their revenge and prepare to return to once again take what they desired.
당은 지당을 저기 맞아미 정어도 저거에서 맞아 내가 빈 소속이 터봐 있나야 안타지 고션달 바치 뉴버 지금 주고 튕긴 줍고 뉴버 첨부 차야도 양자 수마자 용거에서 지금 아주 저 되게 아두시 용거에서 다디디니스도 배로시 되는 정도.
So the illustration in these first three lines is that from our ordinary world, where with a conflict between enemies, that one may win a battle, maybe even win a war, but one does not gain freedom from them. They will be dispelled. One may think one is freed of this problem, but they will just return again.
녀모 저수에 대단 자와 면스. 그래서 녀모 봐서 되는 말에서 되는 저 말에서 녀모 자남 녀모 저 대단 자와 면스 되는 거 녀모 봐 저어서야지 맞으야 된용어마 자원이 되가서 아주기로 소수기로 유되게 녀모 봐들레스. 그래서 이 녀모 봐디 아주기 녀보 된 다음에 봐도 베시랍kum 파벨람 냠술 렌제 람비 톱기 고 빵바 있나 아니 고 빵샤바 메바 쇠는 파비네 메바 쇠 빵바 있나 아니 야야 안 추용어제 야야 소소렌데 비기레선 되네 예요요 말해서 제가 대시 아주기 지다 자오 파바세미 디게된 파비비네 아니고 튕게 야고 찾아 야야 추자제가 리투도 와스 디나시 녀모바데 되네요 말고 그 빵샤바 님베도기 람곰베도기 빵샤도 야자수 용어제네 아저리아 네비게 용어요 말해서 제가 파바디나 자와 말해서 저 말해서.
And with the fourth line, but there is no similar course for this enemy, my afflictions. So what we've seen in the first three lines is a situation for our ordinary enemies in the world, but for our actual enemy, those afflictions abiding on our continuum, when they have been dispelled through the cultivation of a mental path of the wisdom realizing emptiness, they can never return. Once the afflictions have been dispelled from the mind, they can never return.
자워디게 파 지상한 저기 자워디 매바 쇠베네 파 비니 매바 쇠베네 마라게 매바 좀베네 아니 야게고 니버 첨부 쇠시네 야게 다지 야게 수마 안절이야 너게 용구도 와서 근데 녀모바디게 데니스 방션에 야게 아니 다데 님보된 방베네 야게고 수용하지 야게 너게 용시로 와서 그렇다 데네게 도가 용베네 데네 마디다 지바 말 용구 말이에스 그래서네 nga 저기 녀모바세 자워디 방에디 디 님보 땡 가다 미디초 랑기 세미킬로 예베게 님보 다음에 것도 베시라콤 파벨람 대안에 람 곰베데네 파벨 다음에 봉순도 베케바디 니 곰발에 되네 아니 파벨람 이데 빵고래 빵요도 그 사본나 제바 빵사바래 사본나 제바 빵요도 야게 수기네 게요 말이에스 진짜 니네 디나심 고 녀모바 빵베네 야게 이를 선배 도고사고 말해서
So the essence of this verse is that it is to deal with the hesitation that may well arise, thinking that, well, just like in our daily life, our everyday life, when we have problems and difficulties and we try and get over them, sometimes we do, we have a success, but they just return. Is that not also going to be the case with these inner enemies, these afflictions? Because I've come to understand through the presentation from Shantideva up to this point that my actual enemy are these afflictions. But if I eradicate them, which I also appreciate, will take tremendous effort. Is that effort really worthwhile? And that really is the crux of the doubt that is being challenged here. Is this great effort that is required, is it really worthwhile? Because weren't these afflictions, just like my other enemies, one day return again? But the reality is, unlike ordinary enemies, when the afflictions have been eradicated through the cultivation of the direct antidote, the wisdom directly realizing emptiness, because the afflictions have been eradicated from their very root, their seeds have also been eradicated, they can never arise again.
And nyumo shirab migi pang dayi lesa gandu drobar gyul gandu ne danu jachirung lushen dala zumba mebar says.
The 46th verse. When delusions, afflictions are abandoned by the eye of wisdom, where will they go when removed from my mind? Where will they dwell so as to later return and harm me again? But weak-minded, I've been reduced to making no effort. So the verse starts with delusions, afflictions. So it's the same word, I've just translated it differently. It could be afflictions, afflictions. So this first term, the first term delusion or affliction, this refers to what has just been mentioned about the afflictions, that they are the very root cause of our circling in the suffering realms of samsara. But when they are eradicated, when they've been cut at the root, they will never be able to return again. So that's the meaning then of the first term, translated as delusion.
And you were to Moshe, that Dinigi Numo Batia, that is in answer call you so Numo Batia, and it so could say you doesn't Maripa, lo, and it Maripa Latin Javares. It's not that Numo Bagi, you saw doesn't Maribatilla, Nimbo, Damebo to be Sherap Comba Latine, Combaina, and the Comne, and the Bound Curie, you more Sherap Big Pang said, Sherap Mix said, Damebo, also to be Sherap. Combalatine, Batures, Pangres. Nyomo body, you can't let Javaris, Nyomo body, and say you doesn't maripa, Loshe doesn't maripa, the two ability in the keywords. Tis not doesn't marry, say Nyomo be, say you doesn't maripa della, and Nibo Tamebo to be share up, Gomne, Tamio to be share up the Combalatine, the Pangres, Pangores.
And now the second term, the affliction. So again, it's the same word, delusions, afflictions. Here, this refers to the very root of all the afflictions, which is the affliction that is the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping. So this is the root from which all the afflictions arise. So when this is eradicated, no other affliction can arise. And it is eradicated through the cultivation of the particular antidote, the particular direct antidote, which is the wisdom directly realizing emptiness.
It's not time about to be share up Kumbala, then a papi lamundu Gushe Pamba Inza, and Gangdu, Nene, Da Chir, Da Nechir Miong, says not that Yomo body. Dame about to be share of combat popular Monson Tamil to share Monson to be combat, Tine, Sapona Chiba Pongba Inza, Rangi Semla, near Yomar, start when near say, near big she made Yomar, Meva Charles, Rang Gandu near Yobar, Nibig, Tin Cora Meva Chasa, Savona Jeva Meva Chaza, with Tin Yomobi say Tin, Savon Cora Meva Sesha Benza, Gandu Nibig, near Savon, near Yomaris, Meva Inza, Yomo body, and ya, and da, Yanga social. Gini never jay on my yomares, down near Chashim, Chim Yons, and Yomares, Chiron said, Chiron yomares or that. 말에 강도 내내 다뇌 치 뇌자 치무치롱 세도아 와지자데 치롱 세디 치롱와 요 말에서 야죠 용 말에서 되게 미민도 어제 되려야 강도 내내 세도 뇽몽바 사보나 제바 빵바 인자 뇽몽바 내식이 띵 호로 매바레스 강도 내내 메숨바데시고 대지 다이엘에 사 강도 줘 줄선 제가 다기 이순이베들와 제자디 뇽몽바 사보나 제바 빵바자 랑게 셈기 땡도 네요 말레스 제가 네바요 말 강도 샨다 줘요 말레스 랑게 셈기 땡도 네바 메르가스는 다음에 보통 비셔라 온도 교육에 파베 람 공비 고 사본제 빵요도 랑게 셈기도 내내 봐레스 다이스 제자 다이 레살스 다이스 사바 셈나도 요바 메바 쇠바레스 강도 조스는 샤다 좋아요 말했다 셈레 신 유치로도 좋아요 여러분은 디아요 말해서 한다고 지시해 다고 니베디 어디
We can actually change the translation of the second line and the third line, just remove it as a question and make it into a statement. So just read it with the first line then. When delusions, afflictions are abandoned by the eye of wisdom, they will be removed from my mind. They will have nowhere to dwell and later return and harm me again. So this then points to when the Arya path has been cultivated through wisdom, through the wisdom that directly realizes emptiness being cultivated, then the afflictions with their seeds will be completely removed from their mind, and they will have nowhere to abide, nowhere to call home, from whence they could later return and harm once again.
지사다 랑게 셈미텐도 사보나 제바 빵사와 인자 안에 셈미텐데 메바스 차례 안에 셈레션 치로를 기티 취유텐도 조사야 요말 되는 존네바 메바 지사 메바자 강도 네세데 냐뇽몽바디 네세기 띵코라 메바 차사데 띵 메바 차사 다 냐뇽몽바 자와네 용서 메바레스 메바자 몽몽바네 야자 수 용자 달라 녀바샤 용그레스니 다 녀자실 원와메스 치치롱세
Once this direct antidote has been cultivated, the afflictions are completely removed from the mind because the seeds are eradicated too. Therefore, they will have nowhere that they can abide and later return to do harm.
자다 뉴몬버디 사본의 집에 방법이나 호기세기 사본 그런지 그런 매반자다 양계게 매바로 단 뉴몬버 사본의 집에 마방바이나 파빌람 공비 또기 공제냐 공네 마공바이나 뉴몬버 사본의 방투고 말 뉴몬버 사본의 집에 마방바이나 내가 뉴몬버 매바로 차와이네야 아니 양계 뉴몬버 주문도 규르치네 끼네 아니 양계 내가 집에 용고로 받아 제가 사본의 집에 방샤바이나 대용하여 말해서
Key point being made here is that for the afflictions to be eradicated so that they can never return, the seeds of the afflictions have to also be eradicated. Until the seeds are also eradicated, the afflictions will return. They'll be subdued, but they will eventually return. So therefore, one needs to develop the direct antidote to the afflictions, which is the wisdom realizing emptiness, in particular, the direct realization of emptiness, which comes with the attainment of the Arya paths. Then and then alone are the seeds of the afflictions eradicated.
dine lo shen da la zunba me bar se da dine ge lo shen ba de le lo shen se de ka shin na la lo shen ba se lo shen ba se ne de da me ba to be she ra ma gong ba ani shen ba la na dine ge ji tin be lam ro kom ne ani ji lam gong ba da me ba to be she ra ma gong de lo shen ba se de ma ni ba chung wa se ro ji sa dine ge da me ba to be she ra ma gong be lo shen ba de so ya 내가 뇽몽바로 지메바 쇠바 이나야 요베는 제리아 뇽몽바디 다음에 또 이셔를 배수치네 마곤바 인사 아니 내려지네 야게 뇽몽바 제와 용구리 했기네 내가 제가 용구리 해서 레션달라 좀바 메버세세 아 좀바 메버세 ma lojen dala zumba meba sesen dame ba tobe share le bezuin cheche komba mena tene kasore yaja de nyomo ba de saban je ba yo seyo ma me ba za ko yaja su jeje nyomo bege neba je kan neba yungure eso.
In the fourth line, but weak-minded, I've been reduced to making no effort. So this then should probably be translated differently too, because what it refers to is whilst one has not yet realized emptiness directly, so until one has attained an Arya path, even on an ordinary path, lacking the direct realization of emptiness, one's mind is still too weak to have the sufficient strength required to ensure that the afflictions never can arise. So being weak-minded here refers to that the realizations that one has are too weak to eradicate the afflictions entirely. So therefore, further effort has to be made.
수도 수면에 기한 주요로 봐. 되서라 내내 제단야가 문도 녀모바 되비 녀모바 문주와디에 방고어디 그 시라나마 진에 람나tin 지딘베 람나tin 내 방와리 다음에 보도 비셔라 겁네 방바 말이 인자다 몽바네 야야 아니 뉴바디 바냠네 아니 녀모바 되비 녀모 온도 규르체 다디 왕기 아직 나서래 개발해 봐 개와 연구를 해서 그러다 베로스 that is what the senior Shiraki number senior to or what the senior to something in which Yamju to get the younger than Trupche, the Vinyomo Bachaza, Rabacha, when you punch the Vinyomo, Sabon your mother's doing you might get Yakapia Yomanda. Mambu, the Cheman Mado.
We can also then understand that this can refer to if one cultivates an ordinary path. So this would refer to the path that an ordinary being can cultivate with a wish to attain a rebirth in one of the God realms. So one attains a powerful concentration of the form realm and develops a strong aversion to the desire realm and rather wanting to abide in the form realms. And in this way, one is cultivating the causes to be reborn as a god of the form realm, and one may well attain such a rebirth. But eventually, the strength of that concentration will be lost, and one will take rebirth again, probably in the lower realms. So thereby, one's mind lacks the strength required to actually uproot the afflictions, because through developing a concentration and developing a strong liking for the pleasures, the mental pleasures of the form realm, and a strong aversion towards the coarser minds of the desire realm, one suppresses the afflictions of the desire realm, but only suppresses them. The seeds of the afflictions haven't even been touched, let alone uprooted.
Anji Gopala Nyamba Shadugan, the Niki, Nyamba Shadugan, Tiki, Yamsha, Gopala Nyamba Shadan Duzula, good things in Combe, Doki, Yomoba, Yamar, Gopala Nyamba Shu, Yomobini, Mondukuryomara. In that Yomoba Sabot Jeba, Dame about to begin things in Comche, and Yomoba Sabon the Jeba, Mapamba Insa, Maobana, Yaya, Yomoba on the Gurias, on the Gurche, then Yomobi, actually, as a Kovale, Masola Java Yunguris, or rather. Gopala Nyambasha. Chitimbe Lam Sura. That is the said Chitimbe Lam Shirana Machilam, says Shora. That the Gopala Nyambasha, she near top search, Nyamja, Sim Chasan, Rapa Chasan Paga, Chasan Meva, you, Kapagas in the Ganzam Chili. Same guy I want to my UH, same guy, Loma Winyabasha, to a Jungo, Delia, Gopala Nyambasha, which is a Delia, same union to go my to Sine. Loma Winyamba, the Nego Gopala Nyambasha, the Kabla, she's a good new moment to Yomarua. 이내다 마음바다 뉴몽도 여러서 요래 가서 그 뉴몽바 사본데 제가 봐요 말. 그 지딘비가 람 띵이지 시내요 검바 점마도 냠바 샤바마도 다음에 보도 비시라 검제 근데 제신 냠바 셰베 냠바 샤제 그 샤교 말했어. 제가 뉴몽바 봐요 말했어. 그래서 내가 거를 띵이지 검베 돕기 뉴몽바 셈 차상 가 샤반자 게마주 봐서 뉴몽바 차상 게요 말했어. 그래서 셈 가샤 말이죠. 문도 교와 요 말이 매봐서 이나야다고 마음바나 가서 셴바 뇽모바 다음에 보도 비시라 마음바 인자 되네 야자 뇽모 사원 요래 인자 야자고 문도 교용 그래서 고발을 냠바샤바 람세디 가서 람원이들 다음에 보도 비시라 공부해 지오래 지라 남바진이 람세 대시 다음에 뭐 띵이지 신의 줍체 대바디 빼 맛이 채통도 내나서 빼 독자레샤 유행경에다 델레때 삼대시 삼대 당부 빼 야후레샤스 베스 시와다 시와스든 델레야 뇽모바 민도 칼라사고 민도 내나서 민도 안 체링부레샤스 베 대발 빼직 칼라사고도 류레 내나서도 빼직 채통도레샤 안 요라서도 되네게 대바 유행경에다 되네 안 델레때 삼대 당부 빼 맛이 시와레샤스 베 되네 공과죠 딜람델 삼노다 띵인진델 시라나마제 남고 시바 삼대 당보의 시와죠 되발 딜람디 곰곰 되네 띵인진 줍두요 디기 깨발이야 가와스 규세거선 삼대 당보의 깨발인 비 규세거 디시소나 제만은 삼대 당보의 깨발인 거래 제사 되네 그 곰비 시라나밀람 곰비도 디규라 시라나밀람 뇽몽베 되비 뇽몽기 뇽보로 차고래 제사 되비 뇽그 내가 빙다 균이기에 매바지 가셔고래 용거 말해. 제가 디시라나 맞게 람네트는 빠와래라고. 네. 예.
So for such a practitioner then, they would develop a mental path, which it's called a path having the aspect of peace and coarseness. So they look to the form realm as being very peaceful, which of course it is, and they yearn for that. So having developed single pointed concentration, they yearn to develop the first concentration, and they meditate on the great benefits of such an existence, such a mental state, and they look at the coarseness. So it's called a path having the aspect of peace and coarseness. So they look at the peace, or the mental peace of the first concentration, and they look at the coarseness of the minds of a being in the desire realm, and also the general existence of a being in the desire realm. And they develop this repulsion towards continuing to be a being of the desire realm, but develop a yearning for to live to abide in the form realm. So in this way, they've developed in this life as a human, they've developed a mind of calm abiding, but they're yearning now to develop that further into a mind of the first concentration. This then becomes a cause for them that in their next rebirth, they'll leave the desire realm behind and take rebirth as a god in the form realm, because they've created the cause, this mind of the first concentration, and they have a strong yearning for the peace of the form realm, and a strong repulsion towards the coarseness of the existence in the desire realm.
셈 락바 차상 파 가제 셈 차상 오늘 유주고 말다 가지래 셈 디삼다는 되네 남도 기네 되네 강한 책도 셈 차상 파 가고래 셈 차상 가 강야 진짜 셈 차상 가도 시 왕셰다 차상 가네 이기셰바 락바 차상 가진데 이기셰바 참마도 연구 말해 이 띵이진 삼대 용어신 좀 탑데 띵이진 공고래 제가 데네 공부하는 코로나 좀 탈배 남래서 디지 디람고 디코나 탈바 토브레서 탈배 남지 디 공부해서 데네 검지지 데네 우신양바 샨베 유닝부도 이거래 데네게 제가 데고 아니 데네 시내 가와지월링에서는 야 감공 술이야 두시메비 염죽세야 돼 두시메 봐와서 니지요래 얘네 두시메비 염죽세 하 책은 보세요 두시메비 염죽세 데레 지월링 거래 라래 데레 지월링도 다 계속해서 배삼로 지어래서 두시 지어래서 데네요 말해서 가워요 데네 시디 다 시도 삼배삼로 디마요 말해 제가 디시도 되냐와기로 그래서 제가 데네게 제가 그 데네게 두시메비 고발은 냠바샤 중에 디기 냠주 공부가 디길이야 내가는 녀모고 차산 셈주 차산 가셔봐서 녀모고 차산 문을 교에 내봐리 이내 녀모고 사본은 제바 마방바 인자 다음에 뭐또 베셔로 곰니 마방바 인자 뭐바네 안제 녀모고 문을 교시 아니 코로나야 강아지에 연구해서 왔다 단단히 송으로 제가 비센도시 벤 다신 뢰신 달라 몸바 매발세세야 돼
Another illustration of being weak-minded would be where one has achieved also a single point of concentration and develops a path having the aspect of a cessation. But this, whilst the word cessation is used, it's not how we usually think of a cessation, which comes through an actual path, a path leading towards liberation. But this is maybe you could say, this cessation in name only, what it refers to is having intentionally brought to temporary cessation all coarse mental consciousnesses as well as all sense consciousnesses. So one has done so through having a strong aversion to the unpleasantness that one experiences through the sense consciousnesses and the coarser mental consciousnesses. So all of these have been ceased. Hence it's called a path having the aspect of a cessation. So all the coarser mental consciousnesses and the sense consciousnesses have been have ceased. But these cessations are only temporary. Yet the practitioner thinks they've achieved liberation. They then take rebirth as a long life God, thinking that they have attained liberation. But when the causes they have created come to an end, when they cease or expire, they will once again take rebirth as they are still bound in samsara, and they are likely to fall to the lower realms. So this then is another illustration of being of this fourth line, of being weak-minded.
네, 결혼하는데 시행세 정부도에 비슷하네. 그래서 얘들나라 시행세도 비슷 비슷 가시 나라 시행민도 준주 비슷 가시 나라 시행세의 정부민도 정부민도 제가 디 정부민의 시행세 그래. 시행바스는 좋아서 그래. 제가 디서 다디들은 얘들나라 정부의 시행세도 되네. 시행라는 그 진바서 고로 와. 제가 under the chance or that do le shamba said Jizada Donda Nibola Galagosane Jidan Lam Chiraba Namaja Karo Comba in Naya Dame about to be low Comba Mena Dame to be shared to Combo Mena and got Digi Shanda Karating and Karkumba and Digi Nyomo with Zawa Tasinla Nibochi to Mares Jizada Dame to be shared Pizuch Magomba chatting is a Shamba Karakombe and Digi and Yomo Pade, Sabate Japan, two mares, Chizan Mabomazan, or Laria, Yomo Basu, the Kurchin, Rania, and Elias at you and Androma, and Tiwa Yungres or the Buddhist water.
So the meaning then of this fourth line is that even if one develops single point of concentration and develops that into the mind of the form realm, it is still considered to be weak-minded, and it lacks the effort required to actually be able to destroy the afflictions. Because all that such a mind can do is suppress the afflictions. It can do nothing more than that, because this mind of concentration is not an antidote to the afflictions. It can overwhelm them or suppress them, but it cannot eradicate them. So that is the meaning then of the fourth line.
ngā shasāng rā rāshī nīgā lā kāngā dēkhēn dī chāwō ngōni dī kārēsī nā ngā rā nyō mōpa dī rē sāchī. Dāchī tātā nyō mōpa dī tuyā chā khōng rō ngā kia dēnī kī jīgā nyō mōpa dā sōpa chī. Dī shasāng ngā rā dā chāwō ngōni dī sū rē sā. Dī sū kī ngā rā cē dē lē yā dū ngā dī sū tī kō rē. An kia wā chī mā ngā sō lī tī yā tī dī sū kī chī chī nā dū ngā pā tū mē pā nyō chū kō rē sā. Ngā rā cē dī kī ngā rā mī pēn chū o dī sō ngā rā chāwō rē sā dā dī sū ngī sādi ngā tu chūpa jāyadi wā chāwa dūni chāwa chāgō mā rē nyāgāp kānsu jī mā mītūn pī kīngi chūpa rā shōba inā yā jī sō dā chāmbu chāba inā tūmbu chāchā sō sō yin chāyā kī kōp rā kī wā rē jī an dī mēn bī yā jī kā chāmbu mā chāba inā sō sō kī mā rā kia jī kōnsu bī jī rūpa shāntā rā bī shāba inā yā an yā kōnsu yā jī kōnsu yā yu chā rā sā jī chōn chā rī sā jī sā nī nūpa yā chā rā chī 양게 수마자 용구레스 지산디 디수 디네시에스 치타 소세 당아 저기 녀몽바세디 다 디네사오기네 말레스 일단 녀몽바들이야 가지 직파 전부 제바이나 누르르마도 팽가요 말레스 녀바기야마도 판도 인차야 가요 말레스 직제 다 녀몽바들이야 안직 내가 아주 녀몽바 내가 띵이지로 검지 매바 샤브 쇠베네야 안 양게 수기 용구레스 양게 수기레스 다야나 다 녀몽바 디게 녀보디 녀몽바 차상이 요소 유소와디 다시 마릭바리스 지사 다자위 자와디 다시 마릭바세야데스 다시 마릭바디 녀보 다음에고 또 베셔랍 땡제 디콤제 람냠nen제 안데 파베 람냠술 렌제 호기 원숨도 또 베게 셔랍디 콤제 끼나 콤묘도 아니 녀몽바 사본데 제가 빵도 고레스 다 사본데 제가 빵 사와인자 랑기 셈기 때나 균이메바 그런 녀몽바 메바 마치 녀몽바 기세 사본양 그런 메바 쇠바레스 지선다 녀몽바디 치료 현다지 조신이 해요 말레스 진짜 메바자다 라량 균에 겨워요 말레스 이네 녀몽바디랑 균에 싸워이 겨워요 말레스 이네 인상 마지기 녀몽베 님보 담에바 또베 셔럽디 베스에지 공부를 냠는지 제고를 해서 도나 님보지 송월다
The meaning of the 46th verse then is that we are all harmed by our afflictions, or this first term, delusions or afflictions. We have been harmed by these afflictions since beginningless time, and they only ever harm us. So attachments, anger, and so forth, they only bring harm, and they've harmed us in each and every life up to this point, and they will continue to harm us throughout this life and all lives to come. This is all that the delusions or the afflictions do. And when compared to what we normally think of as enemies, unwanted circumstances in the world, other people, and so forth, whilst they can cause us harm, they cannot harm us in the way our afflictions can. Moreover, our relationships with people can change. So, or how we relate to situations, this too can change. So an unwanted situation or an unliked person, the way we relate to them can change. The way they relate to us can change. But with our afflictions, it will never change. They can only, and they ever do, only harm. Moreover, as we saw in the previous verse, or we see in the previous verse, when an external enemy moves away from us, they may well return at a later point and harm us again. We cannot completely escape external enemies, but the inner enemy of the afflictions, these we can escape. We can eradicate them completely, but we need to ensure we do so in the correct manner. Because if we develop or we rely on merely developing single-pointed concentration, which can suppress the afflictions, that will do nothing more than to temporarily suppress them. Rather, what we have to do is develop the direct antidote. So the second term, afflictions, that term refers to the root cause of all our suffering. The particular affliction which is the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true existence. That is the one we need to eradicate, because from it all other delusions, the first term, arise. And we eradicate the root affliction through developing the eye of wisdom. In other words, the wisdom that directly realizes emptiness. And here, this term directly needs to be recognized or acknowledged, in that until the wisdom realizing emptiness is developed to the point where emptiness is realized directly, it's only then that even the direct antidote has sufficient strength to eradicate the afflictions together with their seeds. This is what we need to do, so as to eradicate the afflictions, so that they are the afflictions and their seeds, so that they are, the second line, removed from our mind, and the third line, that having nowhere else to dwell, they will not be able to return and harm me. So how these verses fit into the overall scope of their chapter, this chapter on conscientiousness, is that conscientiousness is an indispensable requirement to be able to eradicate our mind from the afflictions. So whilst the direct antidote is the wisdom realizing emptiness, in order to actually develop the wisdom realizing emptiness, we have to, at the outset, develop conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is indispensable because it's independence on conscientiousness that we develop an abiding ethical restraint, an ethical restraint of sufficient strength, which restrains not just our physical behavior within the parameters of what is ethical, an ethical restraint that is not just restraining our physical behavior and our speech within the realms of what is ethical, but also our mind. Conscientiousness is indispensable for any level of ethical restraint, but in particular for this level here, where we restrain our mind from coming under the influence of the afflictions. Conscientiousness is indispensable. Because what we need to do is in order to develop conscientiousness, we also have to recognize that the afflictions only ever cause harm, and therefore they are never to be entertained. We are never to allow the afflictions to deceive us, to believe us that just now and again, or offers a weak level to follow our desires, that is never to be accepted. So through the recognition that all level of afflictions, every expression of the afflictions is harmful, we can develop conscientiousness. And then being conscientious, we will want to be ethical, and we'll want to restrain our mind from the influence of the afflictions. So this is the relationship then between conscientiousness and ethical restraint. And to develop this, or develop these virtuous factors, we need to rely on analytical meditation, so using reasoning. Hence, Shantideva has presented so many reasons why the afflictions are harmful, to recognize that they always cause harm. And we then will seek out what leads to the arisal of the afflictions within me. Because having seen they're harmful, we'll look for the stimulus that leads to the arisal of our afflictions, and we'll guard against them. We'll also look at the results that come from the arisal of the afflictions, suffering now and in lives to come, for example, rebirth in the lower realms. So this understanding all comes about in dependence on analytical meditation, and that requires the reasons that have been presented throughout this chapter. And moreover, we also require the knowledge that the very root cause for all the afflictions is this ignorance of self-grasping, and that eventually is what we need to eradicate through the cultivation of the direct antidote, the wisdom realizing emptiness. For that to come about, we need conscientiousness with ethical restraint, and also mindfulness and vigilance. These three minds are not always mentioned separately, or individually rather, but they come as a group: conscientiousness, mindfulness, and vigilance. They work together. Conscientiousness ensures that we want to be ethical. We do not want to be under the influence of the afflictions. Conscientiousness has this aspect of being careful. So one is careful of coming under the influence of the afflictions. Vigilance then is the mind that is very aware of our inner process, guarding, aware of whether the afflictions are arising or not. And mindfulness is then mindfulness which has this aspect of recollection. We utilize, when vigilance has noticed the arisal of the afflictions, mindfulness immediately recalls the faults of the afflictions, recalls the antidotes, and we apply them. In particular, if we've been training in the wisdom realizing emptiness, that is the ideal antidote to apply.
nyomo bati nyomo nyimbo teng pangku re sa ji song she de anzu chera cha don da de ko tum do.
This text, engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life, it presents the faults of the afflictions, and it also presents the antidotes to the afflictions. And it explains how the afflictions arise, the harm that they cause now, as well as the results that follow later, as well as how to eliminate the afflictions. So it's all presented in the text. However, the way that it's presented is quite different from what's presented in the Lam Rim. So the Lam Rim is presented in the particular sequence of training. So Jantub Lam Rim, in English, is the graduated stages of training your mind to enlightenment. So there it starts at the very first step of the mental training through in the correct sequence that will eventually lead to enlightenment. So it starts with the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, which starts then with looking at this precious, recognizing this precious human rebirth we've achieved, coming to recognize its impermanence, and then one comes to look at suffering in detail, first of the lower realms, then of the higher realms, and thereafter at the causes of suffering, and then the paths to cultivate, or the antidotes to cultivate, to eradicate the causes of suffering and gain freedom from suffering itself. So this is the sequence that we're very familiar with from the Lam Rim. And this is the sequence to train our mind. Engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life doesn't present that same sequence, because this is a text for someone who's already well trained. So someone who's already engaging in the trainings of the Mahayana, not just an aspiration, but really is striving for enlightenment for the sake of others. This is the ideal text for them. Hence, the very first chapter of this text is not on precious human rebirth. It's on the benefits of bodhicitta. So we should understand then that this text by Shantideva, as well as the Lam Rim texts, the meaning is the same. But the engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life is presented for someone who already has a good understanding of the Dharma and has, at the very least, a sincere aspiration for Buddhahood. But the Lam Rim presents the actual sequence of training to engage in order to achieve enlightenment. Dini kondro se na digi lugi nambyo ta jajyo ngamba chaje shanle nyoba. Dini ge anji kondro onge shanle nyoba tsapchi mo shanle solo nyoba da dini ge shangi chala gyu chala chala tambala sebe ne. Adi tebu maungba na tanya nyeba jaya dan zonga na zoya ki nye dini ge kanga yoba di nga zongo som cheru ka tanga zagu tu kurwa. Cheza soso le dini chungui na dini kanga yoba di nyamyo yoba she. Di menpe da nga zogi penju mi shandale ge kondro sawe na conjure kanga di yoba de nga zu 통고로 봐. 두 규제 sometimes 제사다 체델야 두시는 라신이가 콘로스 강을 되게나 되니 디리 견지의 콘로 디기 제부 몽번다 숙침부터 개와치마 나솔 요베 누가 연구요바데 다시 와라고 제부디 연구요바데 되니기 김sen 제네 김sen 삼다제 몽번다 아니 나솔 쪽 강을 연구요바디 김sen 되니기 김sen 삼다네 삼다 다 직제 안디메비다 미 슝다 가다 덴제나리아 콘르센의 디테보가 마솔 동안 지르스 롱나나 송샤요데 롱나나 송바다 랑기 제바 삼 김세 제바진의 김세 삼다는 이 김바 곧 제부 동안 연구요바디 도시의 삼단 하고 와제디 예시모 제거래. In one's meditations, one calls to mind the various afflictions and anger, attachment, resentment, pride, and so forth. And the key point that must be made is one needs to then engage in analytical meditation to recognize the faults of the afflictions, so as to develop a deep repulsion towards them. Because only in dependence on seeing something as truly harmful will one never want to be influenced by it. And one will then seek out how it arises and ensure that they do not arise again. So to take one as an illustration, anger. So anger is useful to start with because it's so easy to recognize as being harmful. Immediately, as soon as any mind or the class of anger, such as just annoyance, arises, immediately our mental peace is lost. If we were in a good mood, that ends when we're annoyed. And if it's quite strong, we become really unhappy. Our facial expression will change, and just that will bring fear to others, especially if we have built a reputation for being angry. The change of our facial expression will cause fear to arise in others. And when anger is strong, then violence can erupt from us. Violence in terms of how we speak and how we act. We can break our valued possessions, we can do physical harm to others, and certainly emotional harm too to others. From this we see the harm that anger does to ourselves and others. And also, through reflecting on the karmic consequences, it's clear that only harm will follow in lives to come. So this thought process we've just gone through, this is the kind of thought process that one needs to engage in all topics, but in this particular case about the afflictions, because it's only through using reasons that we come to gain conviction that something is a particular way, and then we develop the required determination to bring about change.
And that chapter is sometimes the chapter that in Nagagia, Kondrogia, and the Jig Taudogia, Chasayungurua, Chidepena, usually Chapiki, Chapa Sosuki, Chapa Chimbuchu, and the Sosuki, Jig Jalar, which in the Jig Jalaya, Wachilia, Chatsu, Modaru, Yakushi, Chawashu, Jeza, Delia, Chapushu Chimbuvanza. 소수기 모델들이야 미션다지 야구문의 지지사 근주시나 한샘의 마디시시 콘라인 나요. 다 소수 모델들의 또 현대의 또 시도와 바지 야구를 마치면 양 콘라야다. 아니 지게 도시네 제다 소수기 모델 야구를 받들 차고 치무시 현대의 미션의 로봇들이 소수기 모델들의 교환 이 모델의 야구시 이 콘들이 야가였으면 나야지야. 아니 도시네 and ya Mishanda Moda didn't talk here, only motor the Koya bit, such a talk here. The Nigi, Jisa, Denishing to do she motor some down, so the Jalachi, the Chapa Chapena, the Nigi that the Nigala to Trolla to a simple Sena Shoya, then the Sena Choya, Chado Gea, Naga, then deal it in the corner gear, deal it in the mutumba gear, then Yomo Barimango didn't chapel it in Mambushi or control the tent that Koduja Chama the Sharon Yomo Bashanati, which is a year you know. The chat the chapa the you did a chapakin dinity, and Dime being Jigang, Sosugi, Gabunibo, Sosugi, Roba. That's Chile Chad by the Michile Chad by that Delichan Mishandagi, Gishevan, Lamsam Mishanda Coronaya. Me, Robert Mishanda Tito Assembly, Denigi, the Coronaya Shelia, and Coronaya, and the Chikunja, Media Will Marta, Sekunja, that the Nigi Dushin, Yungo, but the Dushin sometime, the Nigi Chapigi Wangi, the Yumoba. Dictama da Rasinica la Kamadini Yungduas and Bigla, Dusin, Chabi Unga Karkar Yungudu, Dusin, sometimes Jevacha di Chavore.
So anger is a useful affliction to start with because it's so easy to recognize the faults. But it's imperative one follows that same thought process and applies it to attachment, because attachment is so common and arises so easily, and it's so deceptive, often appearing as being a source of pleasure. So we need to recognize attachment for what it is, a source of suffering. And a particular characteristic of attachment is from attachment, so many other afflictions follow. This isn't the case with most other afflictions, but attachment from it, many other afflictions come. So let's take a very simple example, attachment to a possession. So some people take a lot of value their car a lot. So they may be very attached to their car, and being attached to their car, it becomes part of their self-identity, which means if someone criticizes their car, it's as if they're being criticized themselves, and immediately anger will arise. And likewise, if they're driving down the road in this car they find so magnificent, they'll be comparing their car to what other people drive. And pride will arise, this puffed up sense, looking down on others. This expression of pride also has the characteristic of pushing others away, of expanding this artificial space between ourselves and others, keeping them at an even greater emotional distance from us. But then, if we see someone in a car that we envy, then jealousy arises. And if it's someone we know, we have a negative mind towards this person because they have a car that we are jealous about. So we see here how anger, pride, jealousy arise so easily from attachment. And in this instance, to something that is just a car. But in your reflection, take it further. Attachment to points of view, attachment to getting one's way, attachment to people. So let's take the illustration of attachment to a person. If you are attached to someone, let's just say a friend. If someone else criticizes your friend, anger is likely to come up within you. And you may well argue defending your friend and leading to disharmony with this person. So many afflictions arise from attachment. This needs to be recognized because attachment is so pervasive within us.
Anda dinigi dösha da khondu gi gyuen se de kisinga de junjun da song ba na du shin sam da wen da gyuen de ha go ra. Da din da ha go ne dan dösha da khondu de gi gyu me ba la ki go ma gyu ji le de na da ga ri ga ne ski ge do se be da nga du se ne nga so so ra ge so so ra la sam da be ne ji de ji nga de ge ni ma khondu ji la be ne su la be ne an du se ne ji khondu la be sam da be ne 네 직도스는 게 코를 가르쳐서서는 그때 아니 기시지 지금 밑에 바로 차지네 코를라서 배는 게지 감면 좋아서 그 도메라 내가 좋아라 저러 봐다 또 시대 삼다이데 또 코로나이데 소수기 따와디다 밑에 바지 파셔지 제도 소수기 되바디데 밑에 바지 제도 되는 코로나 거스 제상 히 되바데 밑에 바인자 밑에 바지 그 제바인자 텔레야 네 되바데 밑에 바 인자 네디 코로나샤 다 코로나에 코로나에 뒤디 소수기 현다의 코로나디 현다디게 소수기 되바데 밑에 바다 소수기 되바데 도초지 제도 안가서 코로나샤스 제상 네 되바데 밑에 바지 코로나도 왔어 제상 네 되바데 가래서 나세데 나디고도 나세데 제상 나를 지기면도 네 되바 주투문세베 되네 코로나도 왔어 코로나에 김전 되듯이 코로나야데 자과게 왜 있는 다로 나세도 지상 나를 고도세데 네 소수 되바줘도 네 되바도 디고스베 자과기 오래 지상 네 되바세 지상 소수 되바도 튜바이스나 자과기 소수 되바도 미튜바이나 코로나 지난 데네기치도 네 사데 딜리도 와세 노치네 삼다도 코로나야 다 자과기야 되게 소수기 되바다 튜나 미튜베 토네 리기요 바제 나다 네티우도 나를 되어도 나를 되고면도 세도 코로나게 나를 되고도 세데 자와야 되고 세상 나를 되고서 나세데 가래다 나세데 가도서 세상 나세데 가듯이 생기도 세베 되네 나세베 제사 나지게 되차다 코로나게 차사 나세베 삼르딜 용고가 다오도 거래 나와도 시에 제바제도
So the faults briefly mentioned here of anger and attachment. These have been presented in some detail in this chapter already. But what's important in your reflections, you start with what's easy to recognize. The faults of anger is easiest. Then you go to the faults of attachment. And we're talking quite in general, in a way that's easy to understand. But then getting skilled then in this process of analysis is imperative to come close to home, to look at oneself. So look at these arisal of the thoughts of attachment and anger and why they come about. So let's say you're annoyed with a friend about something. And you look at, so why are you annoyed with your friend? So you'll immediately have a reason. That's easy. You'll recognize that, let's say, you wanted to go somewhere. It was a lovely day and you wanted to go outside and they didn't want to. And now you're annoyed with them. So that level of analysis is insufficient. That's very apparent. But when you look just a little deeper, you identify that all that happened is their wishes and your wishes were not in accordance. Or to be very direct to yourself, they wanted something different than you. And therefore, you repulse them, push them away. So from your attachment not being fulfilled, what happens? Aversion follows, and you push this person away. Now you feel a separation between you and them. And this, when we look, we see it happens so often. It doesn't mean we'll never speak to them again. But this doesn't bring about the development of the inner qualities that we want to develop, which is a genuine sense of closeness towards all. And we see here how attachment stands in the way of developing a sense of closeness to all. And likewise, when we feel good in relation to someone, it would take the same instance. The person said, oh, absolutely, I will do what you want. Let's go out today. And now you feel all very happy. So the only difference between these two events is whether the person acted in accordance with your wishes or not. That's it. And you had this different emotional response, but both coming from attachment. Whether your attachment was fulfilled, now you're happy with the person, and when your attachment is not fulfilled, you're pushing them away. This needs to be recognized, because then we see how attachment hurts. Our relationships then, we see how they are really quite superficial, or their basis is quite superficial. It comes down to whether someone at every instance is acting in accordance with our ever-changing moods and desires and wants. That's a very immature basis for relationships with others. So here we recognize that it's from attachment that we either pull towards us, or from attachment aversion arises and we push away. And this comes in many forms of expression. We need to look for this, see it playing out within ourselves. And then, when this is becoming clear, we can spend time and go to the deeper level. Because in this explanation, there's been a lot of reference to I and mine. I want, I don't want. I'm repelling, I'm pulling towards me. So what is this I? Where is this I that wants and that doesn't want? That then is the deeper level of reflection.
Bendigo 제가 공로다 교차되게 간에 그리스기도 심리 제도 나 세배다 나 세배 삼지도 나 될때는 나 심비침바 될때는 기여봐. 그래서 나 세대 나의 되버데 튀마다 내 되버 튀면서 나 세배 삼로들이데 지들기 될래 기여봐 하고 되는 나 세배 짐바티게는 나 세대 간이스도 세배 삼도다 두 지나가 저기 나 세대 가르세 두두 성지 가르스도 세별로야 나나 삼다요 당은 나라야 나 세디 직나 저기 수부디야 수부디레 멤버 로스 예되게 직시 아니 직도 스나가도 수부게 차시야 가야 멤버 딜레 로스 예되게 저와 메티게 ngānsu samlo tāngā te samlo sem tīyā mēmbā dēlē chōwa mē te lōsu yu tīka kōrōng pōngbō tāng sem nā kāngā mā te kōrōng rāngwā te lōsu jik yu te bāru chī ngā samlo nā lā yā tū shī nēngwā rē dēlē dēne kī nā te bē ngā sē te rāngi sem nā pōngbō kāngā yā mā te kōrōng rāngwā tu yu te rāng mē te kōrōng yu te bā chī līng līng shī yu te bā chī nēngwā rē dī nāng chū dī ngā sem lā chā gō rē sē dī tū shī te shim shī te dēne shī chā gō bā te hā gō tū gō rē te ngā bē nā sō sō rā ngā sē te kā te sō ngā sē sam tā te chē sā sō sū kē sam tū tā te sō sū kē sū pū tā sō sō sem nā mā yin bā dē lē lō sō dē lē mā tēn bā chī yu bā te lō lī yā chā bā nāng gō yu bā te hā gō tū gō rē.
When one comes into the deeper level of meditation, or this deeper object of meditation, the first step then is to try and get to sense how the I appears to our mind. And when we look, we see the I or the self appears to be independent from our body and mind, something independent or separate or distinct from our body and mind. It doesn't appear to be our body nor our mind, but something independent, separate or distinct from our body and our mind, our physical and mental aggregates. It appears as if our self, our I, appears to be self-existent. In other words, existent from its own side, exists by way of its own essence or entity, apart, separate, distinct from our body and our mind. So this we need to come to actually recognize for ourselves.
Diniki das tu chine samdana sosugi nga sedi sosugi pumbo dan sosugi sem kala ya ma deba khorong ne yobashi du shen den gor di diniki nga de yobaina dela ne rashin tu ba temba tu ba le gore jesan di nawa de nga senna du shi diniki yobashi nang yo de na di nawa de la rashin tu ba nawa temba tu ba nawa le gore nga da tu ba nawa le gore jesan diniki nawa na shi ji 다가라 요래 선배 삼로 줘라 가지고라 sem단계라 되니 나와 나시 직 요래 선배 되니 삼로 줘 내려가 다도 줘 봐지면 다신소 된지야라 올 다신라 그래 다신소 그래 나 다도 봐 다신소 재산 니 당한 요모 보용서 자게 차사듯이 되셔 공도 나게게 시사 자와 될 때는 기고래서 니 로디 로로시데 재사데 되니게 나 랑게 랑고 풍보다 셔셔 강라 랑군에 봐 나와 나신지 다라 요래 세비진바 한게지게 되는 아주 그래 니라 다세 말이 봐서 오늘이 녀모바 탐지기 자와게 될기 그래 해서지 도시를 좀 그래.
So the self or the I appears to us in this way that it appears to be independent of our body and our mind, or separate from our body and mind, distinct from our body and mind, and appears to be self-existent. So this is the meaning of true existence. In other words, that it exists by way of its own nature or essence. And when it appears, the self appears to us in this way, the self appears to be truly existent or self-existence. So this is the appearance of true existence. And then there's an ignorance that grasps at the self as existing the way that it appears. This is the ignorance of self-grasping, or the ignorance of true grasping. And it is the very root cause of all the afflictions. And it is called an ignorance because whilst the self appears to be self-existent, it doesn't exist by way of its own essence or nature or characteristics. So therefore, this consciousness that grasps at it as existing this way is an ignorance. And this ignorance of self-grasping or true grasping is the very root cause of all our afflictions. From this comes our attachment, our aversion, our pride, and so forth. And the self naturally or innately appears to be self-existent, and naturally or innately it's grasped at as existing in that way. In other words, there is no intention. We don't intentionally think of the self existing this way. It naturally happens.
sem rapumbo da chashi rapumbo da rangi sem kala ya ma de begin de jinga se de na wa na shin chi ma de ba na shi chi pa sim ju zhe ne de kan ya me ba nie me ba dong sang chi ma do kan ya me ba ha ho che go le dong sang chi di me ba zao ki mi do sem ba ha go be lo di dong ba ni do be xie xie di che go je zhen di gong ba le ha go di gong me de di ha go de di lo di da gom che Nubar masu shuk chercher tade deni shinian drup den tingi zin topi nubar chercher tade deni shine di gombe topi da ma zuge da nyomo ba de bangwo les deshi rang ngone gangla ma do ko ngone tuba yore sembe zimba de da deshi jimju che da gangla ma de ba rang lu da sim gangla ma de ba nga deni sim gangla ma de ba ji mindo wa sembe ge tong yo de din tong wa ni lo ga le wa jizen deni ge tong yo lo de nubar gom ga ji shuk chercha we ne da rang Kalamba Rangun de Juba, Nawana, Yore, Sembulodi, Nuba Chun Shurodi, Desha Kondro, Majeti Chun, Leshe. Dizantinic, Lucien, Dicos, Maba Panshabena, in Desha Kondro, Monteseo Mares, Dizantiniki, Dameba to be share of combat, Bangore, said that Dorduro Shuena, Dinesh Sumore.
So this meditation, we first get a feel for how the self appears, which is that it appears to be independent or separate or distinct from our body and mind. So even though our body and mind is changing all the time, our sense of self, it's always there, as if it's unchanging because it's independent of our body and mind. It exists by way of its own essence. It doesn't require the body and mind. So this is how the self appears. Now you've just heard that it doesn't exist in the way that it appears, and there's an ignorance of self-grasping that grasps at it as existing in the way that it appears. So this is the theory that is stated, but in meditation we need to recognize it for ourselves. And this is done through a process of investigation. So we need to investigate, use reasoning to examine, does the self exist in the way that it appears or not? And we keep looking for this independent self, this self that is separate or distinct from the body and the mind, and we'll never be able to find it. And we realize that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And the way that it appears is as if it were self-existent. So the self is empty of being self-existent. That consciousness that realizes that the self is empty of being self-existent is a wisdom, because it's in accordance with reality. And it's the wisdom that realizes the self is empty of self-existence is the wisdom realizing emptiness, or the wisdom realizing selflessness. Every time we engage in this meditation and we recognize how the self appears, and then we seek it and we realize it does not exist in the way that it appears, but it is empty of existing in the way that it appears, we challenge this ignorance of self-grasping. We challenge it with a wisdom, a mind that is in accordance with reality. And as we do this again and again, we weaken this ignorance of self-grasping, which means the very root cause for all our afflictions is being weakened. So our attachment, our anger, our pride, our jealousy, they all get proportionately weakened as we develop this wisdom realizing emptiness, or the wisdom realizing selflessness. And when we are able to develop a particularly powerful meditating mind, the union of calm abiding and meditative insight, whereby we are able to realize emptiness and continue to investigate without any distraction, we will then be developing a powerful enough wisdom that will eventually be able to realize emptiness directly and will be able to eradicate the afflictions together with their seeds. And in this way, complete freedom is attained. Actual cessation of the afflictions is attained. And this is the process by which we will come to attain that freedom. Then thank you very much. Then we can conclude therefore this week. Thank you. Cameron, sure.
Earlier, on the subject of developing repulsion for the afflictions, is it appropriate to develop revulsion of the afflictions of others, or is this contrary to developing equanimity and universal love and compassion? Or should we just simply apply this only to ourselves?
So in the process of developing repulsion towards one's afflictions, should one also develop repulsion towards afflictions of others, or should one be on guard against doing that because perhaps it will damage our equanimity or feeling of closeness towards them, something like that, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
지나디로와 소소냐면 제발은 당부 수수규를 녀모디 교인에게 사사하고 같이 지나하고 지는 랑레 녀모제에 강하다 아신이걸 동안 지겨봐 교인이 봐 세부하고나 소수기디 매봐서고 와서 봐 지나다 디니시 타와치미 추년을 디니 기강하디 랑게 냠용법에 샤는 파삼다지 셴이 심규를 녀모제에 동안다 디기 코로나에 강아지고 샤네 강아지고 나설게 유사고래 집에 삼다시네 고녀모데 누저지만 미델 누저에 삼다겨 말이 미델 인지 공부래 거기 되셔 깨봐도 공부되게 녀모가 누가래서 아주 수익을 녀모게 찍바로와 누가 매봐주고 제세들이 녀모 깨세게 수수기 녀모를 견담아도 수수 누저에 삼고 말와 제가 수수 녀모를 매봐주고 말도 수수를 매봐주고 삼는 거 말. 이 나시 수수기 녀모 삼다 이 강한 노주인바 하고네 디 냠용 빠비게 생기기를 녀모지들이 되셔 공로제는 배두자를 디 약부 말했어. 다고고 디 녀모지 미코라레 강한 지고를 닝제에서 비고 이젠다들 닝제고. 배다때 제산디 고유주의 강한 세딩이 콜리아 탑람 코 강한 녀모 매바시요. 코 강한 세딩이 탑람 가듯이야 지투사래서 비. 콜 판도 가는 지투사래서 비. 또 삼당고 거래. 제산디 디 나는 수수당보 수수기를 녀모지 강한 제산 녀모지 계산데 삼다 디서서 냠냠하고도 시한을 삼다 신이 되게 제산 디강아디 마세에게 신이 녀모만 세에게 탑람 가는지 니 판도 고 강아 세 강아 세다 퀄리티 가는지 투투서에서 비게 삼당 걸마도 그 녀모다 그 녀모다 그 미니디 카야와 같이 얼마도 직바 삼다는 되고 말이야.
This is such a good question because it raises really several crucial points. So when training, you first must start with your own mind. So you look within at your own mind and you look at the role that the afflictions play and you develop this repulsion towards your own afflictions, seeing that they are the enemy that cause you harm, and develop this repulsion towards them and a determination to abandon them. In this process then, and then in this determination to abandon them, you'll want to develop the antidote, the wisdom realizing emptiness. In this process, you will come to recognize that you are not the afflictions. You are not your afflictions. So therefore, your repulsion is not towards yourself. Your repulsion is towards these afflictions. And you will have, so this word we don't usually use in this context, but it's the mind of definite emergence can be called self-compassion. You'll have compassion for yourself because you understand the afflictions are causing your suffering. But you'll want to eradicate them through wisdom. But you'll not be identifying as your afflictions. You'll not be identifying as a desirous person, a proud person, an angry person. You won't be seeing yourself as those afflictions. You're wanting to eradicate them. Then one is ideally situated to now focus on others, whilst continuing to strive to abandon one's own afflictions. One will lift one's awareness to others and recognizes that they too are being tormented by their afflictions. They, unlike you, haven't yet recognized that the afflictions are their true enemies. And you realize how deluded they are, and compassion will arise for them. And when their attachment is strong, when their anger is strong, when their pride is strong, and even when they're acting towards you in an unwanted manner, only compassion for them will arise. You will not be seeing them as their afflictions. You won't see them as an angry person. You rather recognize their anger as dominating them. Now with compassion arising, you'll utilize your wisdom that you have been developing in relation to yourself and think, how can I help this person? Firstly, how can I help them right now, at the very least, not to inflame their afflictions? And in the longer term, how can I help them to at least create the causes for happiness, and ideally to reduce their afflictions too? So this is the process that one goes by. And in this way, one will quickly break our current habit of our self-identification with our mind, and we will also then break the habit of confusing others as being their afflictions.
That's all.
Thank you, and thank you all.